Isn't it amazing how God uses such small acts of faith and intentionality to change people's lives in such big ways? Miss Daphne here has an awesome story that has just that in it. Could you share with us a little bit about that?
I'd love to, Todd. I was at a point in my life where I knew that there was something missing. And I met Gloria at work, and she invited me to a Bible study. So I went. And after the Bible study, she asked me what church I went to. And I said, well, I'm actually looking for a church. And she said, I've got just the right church for you. And I said, really? And she said, yes, mine. So she invited me, and I went.
And what was your church experience like?
It was amazing because the Holy Spirit opened my eyes to the fact that Jesus is real and alive. And it wasn't something that was missing. It was someone. It was Jesus.
And then after your church experience, what was your relationship with Gloria like?
Well, we continued the relationship because she discipled me. She walked alongside me for at least a couple of years. She helped me with my prayers, because I really didn't know how to pray, and suggested that I take classes at church, and we're just best of friends.
That is awesome. God using a simple invite and an intentional long-term relationship. That is so exciting. And that's the heart behind our Christmas Eve invite kits this year. And we have a card in here that kind of just suggests a few things that you could add to this kit. We want you to use this kit as a launching pad to start conversations with your neighbors or your coworkers or friends, and build relationships that will not only be a one-time thing and last throughout the rest of the year and hopefully through eternity.
Amen.
Thanks so much for sharing your story with us, Daphne.
You're welcome.
And Merry Christmas, everybody.
Well, hey, GBC, thanks for tuning in to our online service. Our question for this morning is, if you could have anyone in the world pop in on your Christmas celebration this year, who would it be? Saint?
My answer is Chandler Moore. He is a singer from Maverick City Music, which is the best gospel music band on planet Earth right now. So I would pick him. We would sing Christmas carols. It would be fantastic.
Good answer. Well, as a reminder, we have 3 identical Sunday services, and those times are 9:30 a.m., 11 a.m., and 5 p.m.
Yep, and also our Christmas Eve service times have been announced. So we're going to have our 4 family-friendly services at 1 p.m., 2:30 p.m., 4 p.m., and 5:30 p.m. So to avoid overcrowding and to ensure that everyone has a seat, we are asking that everyone signs up, and you can sign up right now at gracie2.org/Christmas.
Well, as usual, there are so many things going on at GBC right now. There's MOPS registration, new women's Bible studies, and global giving opportunities, and so much more. The details on everything that's happening at GBC can be found in the Loop. It's our e-newsletter. It's the best way to stay up to date, and you may subscribe to it at grace2.org/loop.
Yep, and finally, here at Grace Bible Church, we believe that giving is an act of worship. So you may give online at gracie2.org/give or by mailing your offering to our 1300 South Maple Road address. All right, well, I think that's it. Here's Ty.
Perhaps you chose someone famous for your Christmas celebration pop-in. And while that would make things interesting, I imagine that could also make things a bit more complicated. I mean, at our holiday times, we generally have certain routines and things that we do year after year. And having somebody famous be part of one of those celebrations would make at least me overthink everything. Like, we get our house a certain level of clean for holidays, but would it need to be cleaner than that? And what about the food that we often eat at holiday time? Would that be fit for somebody rich and famous if they were at our house? And the way that we greet people at the door, typically with my annoying Labrador kind of running around and covering everybody with fur. Would that be appropriate for somebody if they were like a dignitary or something who came to our house to visit? Or should we lock him away somewhere? I mean, what titles, what names would we even call somebody like that if they were to come to our house? I mean, there's a lot of questions that arise when you are with an important person. Now, it would be still our house. Charity and I own the house. And yet, it wouldn't exactly be our rules, would it? An interesting thing happened recently in a conversation between a talk show host named Trevor Noah and the former President Barack Obama. It was on Noah's stage and his talk show when he asked the former president, "Do you ever miss your name, by the way?" he said. "Because everyone calls you Mr. President, but I feel like if people called me Mr. Daly, I would miss just being called Trevor." And the former president responded with a smile, and he said, "You know, my best friends call me Barack, but you should call me Mr. President." And when he said it, the crowd laughed. It was a cleverly delivered line. But it was also a poignant line, because in a way, what he's saying is, we might be comfortable. This might be your house, so to speak, but it's not necessarily your rules. We are peers in one sense, but not in another. And there's still a certain response that you should have towards a president. A number of years ago, there was an awkward moment when the French president was visiting this memorial site that was commemorating French resistance to the Nazis in World War II. And he was walking along, and there was kind of a low barricade, and a number of people were greeting him and were shaking his hand as he made his way towards this memorial. And as he was working his way down the line, there were a number of high school students who were standing there, and one of these high school students reached out to him and said, "How you going, Manu?" calling him essentially a nickname, like his first name. And when he did it, the president stopped and he looked right at him and he said, "You should call me Mr. President. You're here at an official ceremony and you should behave properly." Now, I don't speak French, and yet I could tell that this was like an awkward moment as this youth quickly sort of got very sheepish and apologetic for not responding properly, and the president sort of said a few more words and patted him on the arm and walked down. Now, that moment was captured on video and picked up by various media outlets. How do you think people responded to that moment? Well, some people on social media sort of responded saying, "Well, of course, he's the president. A certain degree of respect, a certain reaction or response is due to a person of that stature." But other people came out very strongly against the president, saying that he had humiliated this kid in front of an audience. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, can you imagine any other time in history where the leader of a country, a president or a king, would be scolded for demanding respect from some young person who is around them? I mean, if you consider like ancient kingdoms with old kings, if some teenager tried to call a king a nickname, he might lose a little bit more than just face. He might lose his head if he did that sort of thing. You see, it's the king's kingdom, which means it's also the king's rule. So how do we respond when somebody who is truly important arrives? Well, we are in week 2 of our Beginnings sermon series, and wouldn't it be great to have like a new beginning, to think that it was possible to sort of start fresh and start again? When I asked that question last week in our in-person services, I could see the congregation sort of visibly go, yeah. I mean, all of us have some arena in our lives where if we think about it for a while, we think, oh, I just need a do-over. I need to start again, sort of fresh. Like maybe there are certain things in our lives, some of which might not be in our control, but other things that are in our control that have over time sort of captured us. We feel like we take one step forward and then 2 steps back. Or we get into these ruts and we just can't seem to get out of them. And we just think, I just need a fresh start. I just need a new beginning. Well, that's what we've been talking about starting last week. And we'll be talking about that for the next 4 weeks. Beginnings. And part of us looking at and thinking about new beginnings is to look at the way that the gospel writers began their stories about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. How did they begin those stories? So we started with John last week. We're in Matthew this week. And we said last week that it is very important. The beginning of a story is important. First off, because it will either compel us to read more or less of the story to come, right? It can either be really interesting and engaging, or it can be maybe a little bit boring. So today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 1. So let's see how he does in that department. So this is Matthew 1:1. And it says, Biblos Geneseos. Now, maybe you don't know those words. That was the Greek words that I read to you. But Biblos or Bible, and Geneseos, genealogy, Genesis, beginning. And that's what he does right here, right? He says the book or the Bible, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of boring, right? I mean, let's be honest. Most of us, when we start to read this list of names, are not particularly excited to read that. In fact, if one of my children came to me and said, Dad, would you look over this essay paper that I've written for class? And they began that way, I would say something like, the only way you could make this more boring is if you started by saying, Webster's defines genealogy as, or something like that, right? This is not terribly compelling for many of us in our culture, in our day, to read. And before you accuse me of being some cavalier heretic who just, listen, my guess is Matthew knew that it wasn't particularly interesting to read. So then why put it at the beginning? Well, one of the other things we said was that a beginning can make us want to read more or less of the story to come. But a beginning can also do something else, which is it can give us a theme or it can foreshadow something that's going to be happening throughout the rest of the story. Like, it can give us some sort of clues that if we can discern what it is, we'll be able to then understand more of what's happening in the story to come. It's a little bit like Jurassic Park. I mean, who doesn't think of T-Rexes at Christmas time? But Jurassic Park, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's this beautiful moment of foreshadowing right at the very beginning of the film where it's explained that all the dinosaurs were created as females so that they couldn't reproduce, to which the mathematician Ian Malcolm says, somewhat ominously, life finds a way. Well, a short time later, this crew is on this airplane, and the paleontologist sits down, and he takes his seatbelt, and it's actually the two female parts of the seatbelt that don't go together. And he kind of looks around, and then he sort of just ties the seatbelt around himself, kind of just finding a way to make it work, and then it just kind of goes on from there. And it doesn't really pause and explain it, but it's telling you something about how, life is going to find a way. Well, in John, last week, as we started that, we said it was sort of unusual. He started with the word, but then he uses this word believing a couple times, believing, receiving. And as you look through the Gospel of John, it actually becomes a theme that over and over and over again gets said. In fact, at the very end of the Gospel of John, he says, I wrote all this down so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. So John tells us from the very beginning, he gives us this key, and he says, if you can understand this, you'll unlock a lot of what I'm talking about. Well, but Matthew just gave us a list of names. So what possible key could there be for unlocking the rest of the book of Matthew just by looking at names? I mean, it's just names, right? Well, no. I mean, yeah, but no. See, Matthew is doing something here in giving these particular names in this particular way, where he is setting a theme that is going to play its way out through the rest of this story. And for an early Jewish audience, first century, they would have read those names right away and go, oh, they would have found that compelling and insightful to the rest of the story. For us, we kind of miss it in the names. We then see this next story in Matthew 1, which is about Joseph being visited and being called the son of David. And we're like, what is that about? And then we get to chapter 2. And for us, in our culture, it's actually a little bit easier to see the theme of Matthew's beginning by looking at those first handful of verses. So let's look at Matthew 2 and see if we can understand what Matthew's trying to tell us about who Jesus is and how we should respond to him. So this is what it says starting in verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So Matthew wants to start this story by giving us this key to what the rest of the story is going to be about. You see, he wants us to know right from the very beginning by looking at this genealogy, by Joseph being called a son of David, by this encounter with this King Herod guy, and all the way through the very end of the book, where Jesus says at the very end in Matthew 28 that all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me, that Matthew is presenting us something about who Jesus is, that Jesus is the true promised king, that Christmas is the story of the arrival of a king. Yet the setting might feel a little like approachable or familiar, or the circumstances a little bit humble, but we have to recognize by looking through what he's doing here that he's letting us know that this is about a king, the king. And when a king comes to visit, you better respond properly. In these 12 verses, we see 3 very different responses from the different characters. So we're going to work through each of the chief players in the story and their reactions to the arrival of King Jesus. And then we're going to ask ourselves, how are we then responding to the king? So let's look at these 3 sets of characters and see their responses. The first character in this book is Herod. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. So what do we know about Herod the king? Well, about 40 years before this, the Roman Empire had set up Herod's family to sort of rule this area where Bethlehem, Jerusalem were. You see, Israel, it's a small country, and it's always been relatively small in terms of geography, but it's very strategic in its location, and it was very feisty. Like, it was difficult for people to control that particular region. And so the Romans would set up local sort of puppet kings to make sure that those local kings could keep people secure and under control, and then they could keep the tax revenue flowing back to the Roman Empire. And so Herod's family was given control of this area. And Herod was incredibly ambitious to really expand his control and his power. He did incredible building projects. In fact, if you go to Israel today and you look at a lot of what's been built, or a lot of sort of archaeological remains, there's a lot of his sort of fingerprints on these things because he built an incredible amount of stuff. Beyond his ambition to build, he was also pretty driven to take certain wives who would help him advance politically. He took a title for himself where he called himself the King of the Jews, and he would do basically whatever it took to keep expanding his kingdom. In order to do that, he also developed a bit of a reputation for being wildly vicious in making sure he would stamp out anyone who stood in his way. Here's a couple of his highlights. He captured a bandit leader named Ezekias and had him executed. He killed his brother-in-law and his mother-in-law to keep power in his own hands. He likely killed his own wife, Merimne, when he feared that she was trying to usurp his authority. And according to some of the historians, this fact really troubled him. It was this murder of his own wife that drove him mad, because he killed her, but he could never quite get over her. It's like the plot of the worst romantic comedy in the world. He was just a bad dude. He ordered that his sons of his late wife would be strangled when he thought they were trying to overthrow him. At one point, he was so concerned that nobody would mourn for him when he died that he actually invited a bunch of noblemen to come to this gathering place, and these were orders to be carried out after he died. And then his secret guard or secret police were going to then kill those people so that there would be grief throughout the whole nation, and that way at least his mourning would be kind of thrown in there as well. This is like a crazy, bad dude. The historian Josephus called him barbaric. Caesar Augustus said that it is safer to be his sow than his son, and so he's ambitious and he's vicious, and he hears that there's a true king of Israel, a Jewish king who's born in the area. How do you think he responded? Well, we find out that his reaction was one of opposition. When he heard that a king of the Jews had been born, he was, it says, deeply troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, to some degree, they're all like hearing this news is causing buzz, is causing a stir that these foreign travelers had come in looking for this king. But this word, this sort of deeply troubled, disturbed word, it almost has a motion to it. There's this back and forth sort of shaking, troubled anxiety. That you have this older man who may not be the emperor, but he's the biggest fish in this relatively small pond. And he feels threatened by the news that a new king has just been born. And so what we find out is that he is opposed to this baby Jesus, and he does whatever he can to try to crush it. He tries to manipulate the wise men into giving him some insider information on where this might be. We find out later that he sends people to go kill small children to try to take out this heir to the throne that was born. And so we find that he would rather kill or die than bend his knee to another king. So his response was one of opposition, even violent opposition. So who are the other groups in this? Well, the other group in this that often gets overlooked because we jump right to the magi, the wise men, are the scribes. Now, due to Herod's fears and concern, he called in these scribes, these scholars, to try to understand what was happening. The wise men had shown up and they said, we want to find this baby, this king. And he's like, uh-oh. So maybe he's like some of us, that when some of the long prophetic parts of the Bible start getting read, we're like, I can't follow. Maybe he was like that. And so he called in the more learned people to help him understand, okay, what is happening? What are they talking about? And these scribes were, generally speaking, highly educated. They're kind of like bureaucrats. They were experts on Jewish law and life. They oftentimes would serve as sort of local, almost lawyers to help navigate different issues that arose with people. They were very connected to sort of the upper ruling intelligentsia in their area. And so these guys, along with the priests, the scribes and priests, were brought in. And when they were brought in, they were supposed to decode what had been told to them from these wise men about a star and all of that. And when they came in, we find out that they actually understood what some of those signs meant. They probably felt a little bit of nervousness, excitement, whatever, but they understood what it meant. And so they told him, they said, in Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people. So they gave him the right answers as to where this promised king baby would be born. And their reaction? Well, for lack of a better term, procrastination. Like, what's fascinating throughout the rest of this is that as we look at their reaction, seemingly, they did nothing. They gave Herod the information he was seeking for. They knew all of the right answers. And yet, as far as we can tell, they did no other thing to try to discover where this baby was and who this baby was. They don't go to the wise men and say, let us join you. We want to meet the Christ child. They don't go back and start preaching the message that, guys, the hope is truly here. They don't seem to do any of that stuff, despite the fact that they had built their lives on on the Old Testament in many ways. Many of these folks had. And they were looking and waiting for the Messiah. For whatever reason, they didn't feel like now was the time to go seek out whether or not this was true. They were comfortable to just push it off, to maybe someday go discover what was really going on. Herod was disturbed by the news of Christmas, and they were almost indifferent to this news of Christmas. So long as their lives were going smoothly, it seems that they were happy to put things off to a future date. So we have Herod's opposition. We have the scribes' procrastination. And then lastly, we get to our favorite folks in this story, which are the Magi, the wise men. What is their reaction? Well, it's hard for us to know exactly who these guys were. Tradition holds that they were 3 kings, and we have their names preserved through history and all this stuff, but there's not really any biblical history that tells us exactly who they were or kind of what their group of people were like. We know that they came from the east somewhere, perhaps Persia or Babylonia or something like that. We're not told. And they were relatively famous for their learning and their wisdom and their astronomy and maybe even astrology, where they would observe the stars and the planets and they would write it all down and try to discern these certain signs and prophecies. And they were sort of that group of guys. And when they saw the star, they connected it maybe to this prophecy that was given in Numbers 24. Now, this brings us to our Bible incredibly nerdy moment of the day. Bible nerd moment of the day. Now, this is a deep cut, so you're going to have to be ready, but this is a strange story in Numbers chapter 25. There is this evil Moabite king who wants to curse and see bad things happen to the people of God. And so what he does is he hires a seer, I imagine like a wizard or something, named Balaam, to come out and to look over the people as they're kind of traveling through. This is part of the later end of the Exodus story. And to look at them and to curse them. And so Balaam goes out and he sees this sea of God's people and he goes to curse them. And as he's trying to speak curses over them, God takes control of his mouth and he starts to speak blessing over them instead of curses. It's kind of an incredible scene. And he tries 3 different times to say harmful, cruel words and curses over them. And every time he tries, he says prophetic, blessing, profound words. So during one of those sort of profound blessing utterances, he utters something about how a king is going to come and that he will come and there will be a sign, a star that will kind of show where this king is. So whether or not these Magi knew specifically about Balaam's prophecy, and it seems like they may have, as they looked in the heavens, saw a star and they connected it to, this must be a king, a special promised king, and we need to go find him. I mean, look at why they were looking for him. Where is he? They asked to Herod, who has been born king of the Jews. For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. They went to the palace because wouldn't you think that a future promised king would probably be the son of the current king, right? It would be a prince or something. So they go there looking for the king and find that he's not there. And so they keep looking for the king. And when they find Jesus, what was their response? Well, their response was one of adoration. If Herod was opposition and the scribes were procrastination, theirs was adoration or even devotion. And going into the house, this is verse 11, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. See, they brought these gifts, they bowed down, and they praised this baby. The text actually tells us that they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. That is some pretty serious worship and adoration that is going on. They knew when they encountered this child that this was not just some teacher or sage or even miracle worker, but that this child was the promised king. And when there's a king that has arrived, there is a certain response that is due to that king. And so, through the story, what Matthew is telling us in the genealogies, he also is telling us in this story that this King Jesus had arisen, and people reacted very differently. Some with opposition, some with procrastination, and still others with adoration. And the question I have is, why, though? Why do some react to the arrival of Jesus with opposition or procrastination or adoration? What's the difference in what's going on in that person that they respond so differently? Well, as I thought a little bit more about that, it seems that Herod's reaction to this announcement of King Jesus' arrival was essentially that the arrival of King Jesus would be bad for Herod. In other words, Herod thought, if another king is coming, that king is going to take something from me. He's not here to bring me a good time. He is here to take something that I believe to be mine. In some ways, Herod is not really all that different than some of us. All of us, in some way, sort of think of ourselves as many kings and queens. And our hearts are spiritually, from birth, kind of opposed to anyone telling us what to do. You're not the boss of me, right? Like, our hearts want to be free in a way that we get to decide what is really right and correct. And even as we get older and we begin to sort of change and learn and grow, we want to then build our own personal kingdoms. And the idea that Jesus is a king can be incredibly threatening to us, because it seems like if Jesus is king, then that might mean I don't get to be king. That if Jesus has arrived, then he's going to take something from me rather than give something to me. And so his arrival, the news of Christmas even, in some ways is almost troubling or perplexing and can draw out some intense opposition in our spirits. So that's why Herod reacted that way, because he thought, oh, Jesus' arrival, oh, that's a bad thing. Why did the scribes then react the way they did? Well, they may not have thought that this arrival of a king was a bad thing, but maybe what they thought was that it wasn't a particularly good thing. Like, they didn't see much value added or something to their lives in going to seek out this Christ child. They weren't concerned about losing their power necessarily, at least at this point, but maybe they were also just thinking, you know what, life is working for us. We get along with the important people. King Herod calls us into his courts. All of these things mean we have influence and some degree of power, so life is working. And whatever this could be, if there's some sort of rebellion, this could mess us up. And we're not terrified of it hurting us, but we're just not sure that it's a good enough thing for us to change our lives concerning this. Now, what's fascinating, because I think some of us are going, hey, I'm not opposed to Jesus. I'm just not there yet. I'm sort of like, I'm not really seeking him. I'm just sort of like, whatever. What's really interesting is that procrastination ultimately turns into opposition. Do you know throughout the rest of Matthew and the other gospel stories, do you know who becomes kind of the leading opposition group to Jesus? When Jesus is teaching and doing miracles and he's having all these like hard conversations and people are trying to kill him, it's not Herod that is going after him as his chief opponent. It is actually the scribes, the priests, the Pharisees. These folks whose lives had been working for them, and they were not willing to come and to bend their knee to Jesus any more than Herod. Yes, Herod's badness was very easy to see. But throughout the rest of the gospel, we'll see that it's not just a Herod problem. It's also their problem. In the end, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. And so probably our reaction shouldn't try to be to push it off or to directly oppose, because both of those are essentially the same. Our reaction should be more similar to that of the Magi, which was because they believed that the arrival of King Jesus was actually the greatest news of all. So when they showed up with humble hearts, with generous spirits, and a desire to worship this new promised king. So what's your response to this news of the arrival of King Jesus? Matthew shows us from the very beginning, whether it's the genealogy or this moment, this dream that his dad Joseph has, or it's this birth of Jesus and this conflict between the evil king and this new baby king. What is your reaction to the arrival of King Jesus? You know, at the very beginning, I said, if you could have somebody come to your house and pop in on your Christmas celebrations and they were famous, wouldn't you sort of consider everything? Like cleanliness and greetings and titles and all these things? And the truth is, I would. I mean, even if it wasn't a dignitary, it was just some YouTube star that my kids thought was amazing, I would still overthink every little arena of having them in my home and in my space. And so when we consider that God himself came to earth, how do you respond to that news? I'm going to ask again our favorite question from the series, which is, wouldn't it be nice to have a new beginning? You know, some of us, we feel a little trapped, a little stuck, a little bit like we're in a rut, and we're not sure how to escape. We take one step forward, and then we take two steps back. And there could be any number of reasons why we feel that many things are outside of our control, but there are also some things that are within our control. And I wonder if the reason why some of us feel so desperate for a new beginning is because we're actually missing something about what it means that King Jesus has arrived. You see, I think any resistance we have to the arrival of King Jesus and just worshiping and adoring him starts with the fact that we think about the fact that a king's going to come and rule us. And a king does rule us. But sometimes I think we forget that kings also come to rescue their people. That they aren't just coming to take things from us, but they are actually coming to offer something to us, an opportunity to live in their kingdom, to live with their purposes, to live in their security, to live free from death at the hands of an enemy. And so King Jesus does come. But when he comes to give himself so that he might be a ransom for us. Yes, he will rule us, but he's also here to rescue us. Do you realize that? Because if we're holding back, we're going to find ourselves in these ruts over and over and over again. F.B. Meyer was a pastor in the 1900s, somewhere late 1800s, early 1900s in England, and he was an author, and he was this powerful dude. He hung out with D.L. Moody and other those guys, and he talked about this moment in his life when he first came to surrender, really to surrender his life to Christ. And he says, I remember so well when Christ came to my heart and challenged me as to the keys of the fortress. He said, it was like, Jesus was like, look, give me the keys to your heart as to a fortress. He said, I remember that so well. But before I gave them to him, he said, I put one small key in my pocket. And he said, when I did that, I gave Jesus the other keys, and he gave the keys back to me. And he said, when he gave the keys back to me, he looked at me with those eyes which are as a flame of fire and said, are all the keys there? And I said, well, all but this. I cannot give it, but I am willing for you to take it. And he said, Jesus looked at me and he took it. And they were all his. Some of us feel like we need a new beginning. And my question for us is there some arena in our lives where we've been so worried about Jesus taking as opposed to giving, that we've actually kind of kept that little key to ourselves and we're sort of hiding it. And we're kind of like, well, Jesus, I'll give you this part of my life and I'll give you that part of my life. I'll let you be king over this. But I'm not sure that I can trust you with that. Is there something like that you've been hanging on to yourself, that you've been procrastinating, letting him have it? Listen, it may not be gold or frankincense or myrrh, but it is a precious thing when people humbly allow Jesus to be king of their whole lives. When a king arrives, you can either oppose or adore him. Let's adore the one who's offered everything to us and pray that even if we can't give it, that he would take that from us. Let's pray together. Father, I would ask that in this just kind of moment of confession, as we consider our own response to the news of Christ's birth. I mean, maybe we've just heard it so many times, it's hard to get through that sort of crust of familiarity. But God, would you give us a moment to just look internally and see if there is some piece of our ridiculous little kingdom that we're trying to hold for ourselves. And God, it's difficult for us to give up those things, but we're willing for you to take them because you're a king who's come, not just to take, but to give your very life. And so we place our trust in Jesus today, and we thank you for the promise of new beginnings. Amen.
Watch out.